Hello, welcome back to Dephine. My name is Dephine and this is the second part of our first lecture, Introduction to Law. In this video, we are going to discuss the relationship between law, morality, and justice. If this is your first time joining us, this is a 3-part lecture. Make sure you go to the playlist and watch the first video before coming to this video. Like I said last time, in this video, we are going to be discussing the relationship between law, morality, and justice. So I shall start with law and morality. Law is law regardless of its moral content. However, most legal rules are derived from morality. This means that law is used to enforce morality. When new laws are enacted, deeply held moral convictions are converted into law. Hence, morality is the bedrock of law, but it is not law. For example, do not kill is a rule of morality. If the state decides to recognize and enforce it, it then becomes a rule of law. But if it is not converted and enforced as law, it remains a rule of morality. Moral rules are converted into law in 3 main ways. Number 1. A moral that is considered so important to the community that it requires legal backing is converted into law by enacting a piece of legislation which incorporates that moral rule. That legislation then becomes the source of the legal rule, but it does not take away the fact that the original source is morality. For example, most people in Zimbabwe would regard it immoral to engage in any form of sexual activity with an animal. This moral perception has been converted into law through the creation of the crime of bestiality, which is Section 74 of the Criminal Law Codification and Reform Act as follows. Any person who knowingly commits any sexual act with an animal or bird shall be guilty of bestiality and liable to a fine up to or exceeding life for 14 or imprisonment for a period not exceeding 1 year or both. Number 2. A moral rule may find its way into law where the law is unclear and the court resorts to moral principles to interpret the law. A court's interpretation is legally binding for the purposes of the case at hand, and as we shall discuss later under the common law system, it becomes, in appropriate cases, part of the law. A prominent example worth noting is the English case of Corbett v. Corbett, where the court was called upon to decide whether or not a man and a person who had undergone a sex change to become a woman would get into a valid marriage under law. The court held that the purported marriage was invalid. The court resorted to what was then morally acceptable, that a valid marriage would only be between a biological man and a biological woman, and that a sex change would not make a man a woman. Make sure to read the case Corbett v. Corbett for further understanding. Another useful example is the American case of Riggs v. Palmer, where the court was called upon to decide whether or not a grandson named in the will of his grandfather would inherit, given that the grandson had murdered his grandfather in order to gain the inheritance. So, generally, a person named as heir in a will is entitled to inherit. However, the court found it immoral to allow the murderer to inherit. The court resorted to the moral principle that no one shall profit by his own fraud and denied the murderer his inheritance. If you find this lecture beneficial, please hit on the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to click on the notification bell so you never miss on our latest lectures. Your support greatly helps us continue with our work here on Legally Dephine. Let's continue with the lecture. Number 3. Moral rules may be converted into law through custom. Some moral rules, through their wide acceptance and observance, may become a binding custom. And as we shall discuss later, custom is a source of law. Now, let's move on to the relationship between law and justice. Law is law whether it is just or unjust. Most legal rules are designed to achieve justice, and lawmakers usually justify their enactments on the basis of justice. However, the fact that a rule is law does not necessarily mean it is just. Justice is just an external standard against which laws are measured, and an unjust law is as much law as a just law. It is said that justice is fairness, and there have been many attempts to define justice. Oxford Reference Dictionary 2003 defines just as acting or done in accordance with what is morally right or fair, and justice as just conduct or fairness. Whereas the Black's Law Dictionary 2004 states that justice is the fair and proper administration of law. It is very important to understand the two senses in which the word justice is used. Number 1, justice according to law is served whenever the law is faithfully executed, whatever the content. Number 2, justice is an ideal form of dealing, relates to the substance of the law, and is an external measure. It is this form of justice that is discussed here as fairness, and is the same justice with which the law may or may not comply. It should be clear, therefore, that whenever justice is used as an external measure of law, law may be considered just or unjust. Accordingly, one may follow the law to the letter, and the outcome may still be unjust, because the law itself is unjust. Since law is law regardless of its fairness, a court of law is therefore obliged to enforce law as it is, regardless of the court's perception of justice. Now, I urge you all to go and read the case Minister of Lands versus Commercial Farmers Union. It's a Supreme Court judgment in 2001, I think. Go and look for that case. The case underscores the main idea that we've been discussing here about law and justice, and that a court of law can only enforce the law as it is. This marks the end of our discussion on the relationship between law, morality, and justice. Law is law regardless of its moral content, and law is law whether it is just or unjust. Don't forget to read the case Corbett versus Corbett, Riggs versus Palmer, and Minister of Lands versus Commercial Farmers Union. If you watched till the end, I appreciate you so much. Don't forget that our lecture is in 3 parts, and the third part shall be on the purposes and functions of law. Thank you for being with us here on Legal Dephine. Until we meet again.